At approximately 3:47 p.m. local time on Thursday, armed soldiers stormed the presidential palace in central Bissau, detaining President Umaro Sissoco Embalo in what appeared to be a meticulously coordinated military takeover. Within minutes, automatic gunfire echoed through the capital's dusty streets as armored vehicles sealed off government buildings and key intersections. By nightfall, Guinea-Bissau, a small West African nation of 2 million people with a notorious history of political instability, found itself plunged into its latest constitutional crisis, one that would expose deep fissures in its military, reveal alleged narco-political conspiracies, and bring the country dangerously close to civil war. The events that unfolded over the subsequent 48 hours represent more than just another coup attempt in a nation that has suffered at least 9 since independence in 1974. They reveal a complex web of grievances, betrayals, and power struggles that have paralyzed governance in one of the world's poorest countries, a nation where the average citizen earns less than $2 a day, yet where cocaine trafficking routes have made certain military and political elites extraordinarily wealthy. President Embalo, 50, came to power following deeply contested elections just weeks before the coup attempt. A former prime minister and army general with a reputation for authoritarian tendencies, Embalo had narrowly defeated his rival Fernando Dias da Costa in a runoff vote that opposition parties immediately denounced as fraudulent. International observers from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, noted irregularities but stopped short of invalidating the results, leaving Embalo's legitimacy in question from his first day in office. Those who know Embalo describe him as ambitious and calculating, a man who styled himself as Guinea-Bissau's strongman, capable of bringing order to a country that has known precious little of it. He promised to combat the drug trafficking that has earned Guinea-Bissau the unwelcome nickname Africa's first narco state, to reform the bloated and faction-ridden military, and to attract foreign investment to jumpstart an economy dependent on cashew exports and international aid. But Embalo's critics, including Dias da Costa and a significant portion of the political opposition, viewed him as merely the latest in a long line of leaders more interested in consolidating personal power than serving the public good. They pointed to his close relationships with certain military commanders, whispered allegations of his own connections to drug trafficking networks, and his increasingly autocratic governing style in the weeks following his disputed election. The tension between Embalo and his opponents had been building steadily. Opposition lawmakers boycotted parliamentary sessions. Protests erupted in Bissau's neighborhoods, with demonstrators demanding a recount or new elections. And within the military, historically the kingmaker in Guinea-Bissau politics, competing factions aligned themselves with different political camps, creating a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on Thursday afternoon. According to multiple sources within the presidential guard who spoke on condition of anonymity, the coup began with an internal betrayal. General Antonio José Silva, the Army Chief of Staff, and a man Embalo had personally appointed just 2 months earlier, had been secretly coordinating with mid-ranking officers who opposed the president's attempts to restructure military command. Silva's motivations remain somewhat murky. Some analysts suggest he was acting on behalf of Dias da Costa's political faction. Others believe he was protecting drug trafficking interests threatened by Embalo's public anti-narcotics rhetoric, however hollow that rhetoric may have been. Still, others maintain that Silva simply saw an opportunity to seize power for himself in a country where military strongmen have historically wielded enormous influence. Whatever his reasons, Silva moved decisively. At approximately 3:45 p.m., he entered the presidential palace for what Embalo believed was a routine security briefing. Within minutes, soldiers loyal to Silva had disarmed the presidential guard, many of whom offered no resistance, and taken control of the building. Embalo was found in his office and placed under arrest without a shot being fired inside the palace itself. The president's detention lasted roughly 6 hours, during which he was held in a secure room in the palace basement, while Silva and his co-conspirators debated their next moves. According to later reports, there was significant disagreement among the coup plotters about whether to exile Embalo, imprison him, or potentially worse. Outside the palace, however, the situation was far more chaotic. News of the president's arrest spread quickly through Bissau, and different military units responded in conflicting ways. Some rallied to Silva's coup, setting up checkpoints and occupying the state radio station. Others, loyal to Embalo or simply opposed to another military intervention, mobilized to defend the constitutional order. By 5:01 p.m., sporadic gunfights had broken out in several neighborhoods as these factions clashed. Civilians fled into their homes, shops shuttered, and the streets of the capital, normally bustling with vendors, motorcycles, and pedestrians, emptied except for armed men in military fatigues. While Embalo sat detained in his own palace, his chief political rival, Fernando Dias da Costa, faced a critical decision. A technocrat and former finance minister, Dias da Costa had built his political career on promises of good governance, transparency, and an end to military interference in civilian affairs. He had legitimately won the first round of voting in the recent election before losing the controversial runoff to Embalo. The coup presented him with a profound dilemma. On one hand, the removal of Embalo, whom Dias da Costa genuinely believed had stolen the election, might create an opportunity to return to power through new elections or a transitional government. On the other hand, endorsing or even tacitly supporting a military coup would undermine everything he claimed to stand for and could set a dangerous precedent that might be used against him in the future. According to sources close to Dias da Costa, he spent the first hours of the coup in emergency meetings with his advisors and opposition party leaders. Some urged him to publicly support the coup, arguing that Embalo's illegitimacy justified his removal by any means necessary. Others counseled caution, warning that association with military intervention could taint his democratic credentials and invite international sanctions. What complicated matters further were the persistent rumors, never fully substantiated but widely believed in Bissau's political circles, that elements of Dias da Costa's coalition had their own connections to the military officers now leading the coup. Some opposition lawmakers had been meeting regularly with mid-ranking officers in the weeks before the takeover, ostensibly to discuss the military's concerns about Embalo's leadership. Whether these meetings constituted conspiracy or simply political networking remained unclear. By evening, Dias da Costa had made his choice. In a carefully worded statement released through social media and opposition-aligned media outlets, he condemned the use of military force to resolve political disputes while simultaneously calling for Embalo to resign and allow new elections. It was a calculated attempt to thread the needle, criticizing the coup while capitalizing on the political opportunity it created. No discussion of Guinea-Bissau's political instability can ignore the elephant in the room: drug trafficking. Since the mid-2000s, the country has served as a critical transshipment point for South American cocaine bound for European markets. Its remote coastline, weak institutions, and poverty-stricken population have made it an ideal logistics hub for international trafficking organizations. The drug trade has corrupted Guinea-Bissau at virtually every level. Military officers, politicians, judges, and police commanders have been implicated in facilitating cocaine shipments through the country. In 2013, the former Navy Chief of Staff was sentenced by a U.S. court for conspiracy to traffic cocaine. Multiple political and military leaders have faced similar allegations, though few have been prosecuted domestically. In the days following the coup attempt, shocking revelations emerged about the extent to which narco-trafficking interests had infiltrated both sides of Guinea-Bissau's political divide. Leaked documents and anonymous sources revealed that both Embalo's camp and elements of the opposition had received funding from individuals with known ties to drug trafficking organizations. These shadow financiers had apparently been hedging their bets, ensuring they would have influence regardless of who controlled the government. Even more disturbing were allegations that some of the military officers involved in the coup had direct operational roles in facilitating drug shipments. For these officers, Embalo's anti-trafficking rhetoric, however insincere, had created uncertainty about their ability to continue profiting from the trade. The coup in this analysis was partly a preemptive strike by narco-military elements seeking to protect their interests. International drug enforcement officials who monitor West African trafficking routes expressed alarm, but not surprise. Guinea-Bissau has been a narco state in all but name for years, one senior DEA official told reporters on Background. Political instability actually serves the traffickers' interests because it prevents any sustained effort to combat their operations. What ultimately prevented the coup from succeeding, or at least from immediately succeeding, was Embalo's resourcefulness and the fractures within the military itself. During his detention, the president managed to convince one of his guards to allow him a brief phone call. Using a smuggled mobile phone, Embalo reached Brigadier General Paulo Correa, commander of the Presidential Guard, who had been away from the palace during the initial takeover. In that 3-minute call, Embalo gave Correa authorization to mobilize loyal troops and attempt to retake the presidential palace. More importantly, he provided intelligence about the coup plotters' positions and numbers, information that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. Correa moved quickly. By 7 p.m., he had assembled approximately 200 soldiers from units loyal to Embalo, along with armed members of the presidential security detail. These forces began advancing on the palace from multiple directions, setting up a potential military confrontation that could have plunged Bissau into open warfare. The next several hours represented the most dangerous period of the entire crisis. As loyal forces surrounded the palace, coup plotters inside prepared defensive positions. Both sides communicated via radio, with increasingly hostile exchanges, suggesting that violence was imminent. Civilians living near the palace compound fled in panic, carrying what belongings they could as military vehicles and armed soldiers filled the streets. International observers watched with growing alarm. The African Union issued a statement condemning the coup and calling for Embalo's immediate release. ECOWAS activated its crisis protocols and began preparing for possible military intervention if the situation deteriorated further. The United Nations Secretary General called for restraint and dialogue, but it was what happened next that truly shocked observers. Both sides began revealing they had infiltrated each other's ranks. In a bizarre turn that speaks to the labyrinthine nature of Guinea-Bissau's military politics, it emerged that both the coup plotters and Embalo's loyalists had placed informants and sympathizers within each other's forces. When Correa's troops surrounded the palace, several officers within that supposedly loyal force were actually sympathetic to the coup. Conversely, some of the soldiers inside the palace who had initially followed Silva's orders were having second thoughts and secretly communicating with Embalo's supporters. This mutual infiltration created a surreal situation where neither side could be entirely certain of its force's loyalty. Commanders on both sides realized that ordering an assault could result in their own troops turning on them mid-battle. The possibility of fratricide and the fog of uncertainty about who would actually fight for whom created a powerful incentive for both camps to pause and reconsider. Additionally, lower-ranking soldiers on both sides, many of them young men from poor families who had joined the military for steady employment, not political intrigue, began communicating with each other. Some were friends or even relatives serving on opposite sides of the standoff. These informal channels revealed a widespread reluctance among ordinary soldiers to kill each other over what many viewed as yet another power struggle between elites who cared little for Guinea-Bissau's common people. By midnight, with tensions at their peak but both sides hesitant to fire the first shot, intermediaries began floating the possibility of negotiations. The meeting that ultimately diffused the immediate crisis took place in an unmarked building in a neutral neighborhood of Bissau, away from the palace standoff. Present were Embalo, who had been released from detention and brought to the location under armed escort; Silva, the army chief of staff who had led the coup; Dias da Costa, representing the political opposition; and several other military and civilian leaders. Also present, crucially, were representatives from ECOWAS and the African Union, who had arrived in Bissau within hours of the coup's outbreak. These international mediators played a critical role in convincing all parties that dialogue was preferable to bloodshed. The negotiations lasted until dawn. According to participants, the atmosphere was tense and occasionally hostile, with old grievances and accusations flying between parties. Embalo accused Silva and Dias da Costa of conspiracy and treason. Silva insisted he had acted to prevent Embalo from establishing a dictatorship. Dias da Costa maintained that the entire crisis stemmed from the illegitimate election that had brought Embalo to power. The breakthrough came when international mediators proposed a framework that would allow all parties to save face while stepping back from the brink. Embalo would remain president, but would agree to form a government of national unity, including opposition members. New parliamentary elections would be held within 6 months, with robust international monitoring. Silva would resign as Army Chief of Staff, but would not face prosecution, instead retiring with full honors. A commission would investigate drug trafficking within the military and political establishment, with international support. None of the parties were entirely satisfied with this arrangement, but all recognized it as preferable to the alternatives. By 5:30 a.m., they had reached a preliminary agreement. By 7 a.m., as Friday's sun rose over a city that had held its breath through the night, both military camps began standing down. The days following the aborted coup have been marked by an uneasy calm. Military checkpoints remain throughout Bissau, though they are gradually being withdrawn. Embalo has appeared on state television, projecting strength while calling for national unity. Dias da Costa has accepted a role in the transitional government, though many of his supporters view this as a compromise with an illegitimate regime. The promised commission to investigate drug trafficking has been established, though few observers expect it to produce meaningful results, given the deep penetration of narco-corruption into Guinea-Bissau's institutions. Several mid-ranking military officers have been quietly reassigned or placed on leave, but no major figures have been arrested or charged. International reaction has been mixed. While ECOWAS and the African Union praise the peaceful resolution, many observers note that the underlying problems that produced the crisis remain unaddressed. Guinea-Bissau's economy is still desperately poor, its institutions remain weak and corrupted, and the military continues to wield disproportionate political power. Human rights organizations have raised concerns about violence during the coup attempt that has received little attention. At least 7 people were killed in the sporadic fighting that broke out on Thursday evening, including 3 civilians caught in crossfire. Dozens more were injured. Journalists attempting to cover the events faced intimidation from both sides, with at least 2 reporters briefly detained by military forces. For Guinea-Bissau watchers, the latest coup attempt represents both something new and something depressingly familiar. The involvement of narco-trafficking interests and the complex web of infiltration and counter-infiltration within the military suggest an even deeper institutional rot than previously understood. Yet the basic pattern, disputed elections leading to military intervention, leading to negotiated settlements that change little, has played out repeatedly since independence. The country's chronic instability has profound consequences beyond its borders. As a major cocaine transshipment point, Guinea-Bissau's dysfunction facilitates drug flows that fuel addiction and violence in Europe. Its weak governance creates opportunities for other forms of transnational crime, from money laundering to arms trafficking, and its persistent poverty and instability generate refugee flows and humanitarian needs that strain regional and international resources. Some analysts argue that meaningful reform in Guinea-Bissau will require not just domestic political will, but sustained international engagement, including development assistance, institution-building support, and pressure on both Guinea-Bissau's elites and the international criminal networks that exploit the country's weakness. Others contend that external interventions have repeatedly failed and that only Guineans themselves can break the cycle of instability once they find leaders willing to put national interests above personal ambition. As Guinea-Bissau emerges from its latest constitutional crisis, the future remains deeply uncertain. The fragile truce brokered in those desperate midnight negotiations could collapse at any moment if any party decides the compromise is unworkable. The upcoming parliamentary elections could either provide a path toward stability or trigger new conflicts if results are again disputed. What is clear is that the fundamental challenges facing Guinea-Bissau, poverty, corruption, weak institutions, drug trafficking, military interference in politics, have not been resolved. The events of those dramatic 48 hours revealed the depth of these problems, but did little to address them. For the people of Guinea-Bissau, life goes on in the shadow of uncertainty. Markets have reopened, children have returned to schools, and the daily struggle for survival continues. But the trauma of armed soldiers in the streets, gunfire echoing through neighborhoods, and the specter of civil war lingers in people's minds. The story of this coup attempt is ultimately the story of a nation trapped in cycles of instability, where the lines between politician, soldier and criminal have blurred beyond recognition, and where the dreams of ordinary citizens for peace, prosperity, and good governance remain perpetually deferred. Whether Guinea-Bissau can finally break these cycles and build a stable, democratic future remains to be seen. For now, the country waits, watches, and hopes, knowing that hope has been disappointed many times before, but unable to surrender it entirely. The true reckoning for Guinea-Bissau is not in what happened during those 48 hours, but in what will happen in the months and years ahead when the spotlight of international attention fades and the country must confront its demons largely alone. Guinea-Bissau's pain is not entertainment. It's a mirror reflecting what happens when the powerful prey on the powerless everywhere. Subscribe not just to stay informed, but to stand in solidarity with Africans building the future their ancestors dreamed of, but never saw. What do you think will be the fate of Guinea-Bissau? Comment your thoughts.